Hey everyone, and welcome back to another race roundup brought to you by the Seedstream F1 app. Where on earth do we start with the Brazilian Grand Prix? It was a chaotic weekend from start to finish, and I kind of loved it. I've been there in many of those weekends. When the rain comes down in Sao Paulo, it can be biblical. I've been in the garages where the rain has been coming in at such a rate and such an angle, it's got the rear wing of the car wet. And by the way, they are backed into that garage. So you can imagine how far and fast that's coming in. That's the levels that came down this weekend. And it turned the weekend on its head. I mean, I don't even know where to start. Look, the fact they postponed qualifying to Sunday, clearly the right decision. Tough though it was for all of those fans. And the fans in Sao Paulo are some of the most dedicated in all of Formula One. They're amazing. Genuinely, they love Formula One more than most. So fair play to them. So it meant that Sunday, today, was an incredibly busy day. Massively early start for all of the teams and the drivers, the media, everybody involved in putting on that show and broadcasting it to the world had a long and difficult and stressful day. Now, I don't want you to all get your violins out because I know they're in Sao Paulo, they're across the other side of the world enjoying something that many of you would love to be there. But this is their job, and it became a whole new set of parameters involved in that today. And I want to explore some of that because some of those new parameters, some of the new procedures that came up today were part of the reasons that some of the chaos ensued. Some drivers won out and others lost out. It's always the way, and this was always something we were taught at McLaren, ironically, as it turns out today. We'll explore that in a moment. When the something out of the ordinary happens, that is when you are at your most vulnerable. We're so conditioned into the procedures of a Grand Prix weekend, into executing the perfect weekend from start to finish in the way that we do it every other weekend. When something weird happens, like qualifying on a Sunday morning or an aborted start, something strange, that's when it's easy to get caught out because you maybe don't understand the rules or are not familiar enough with the rules in those situations. And panic can set in, and that's when poor decisions get made. And some of that happened today. So let's pick it apart as best we can because it was chaos. Let me tell you quickly about Seedstream. Seedstream is what I think is the best place to go and get all of your F1 news and content in one easy place. It's totally free, so please go and download it, either with the link in the description of this video or from any of your app stores. If you are a fan of Matt and Tommy over at P1 on their YouTube channel, hugely popular and successful, they've been using Seedstream this week. Matt particularly been very impressed, is an avid user now. So I'm very grateful to them for trying it out. You may hear more about that as we sort of start to think about forming partnerships over the next few weeks. Right, the Sao Paulo Grand Prix, the Brazilian Grand Prix. Let's talk about, first of all, the fact that Max Verstappen in qualifying was obviously very much hampered by a red flag. In terms of the timing of that red flag, really hampered his lap. And with the 5-second penalty that he had for an engine change as well, meant he was starting on 17th on the grid. Now, with Lando putting it on pole with a blistering lap, McLaren looked so good in the dry around this circuit this weekend. They were dominant, way more dominant than we've seen them in recent weeks. Ferrari were relatively nowhere. Red Bull were quick, but not in the same ballpark as McLaren. Mercedes had disappeared. So this was a weekend when Lando and McLaren could really capitalise and make the most of what was a difficult set of circumstances for Max and Red Bull. And then we get into the race. So McLaren did everything right up to that point, won the sprint, stuck the car on pole for the Grand Prix. And then we get to this point that I talked about earlier on, an aborted start. A slightly different race procedure than we have at most Grand Prix. I can't remember the last time we had an aborted start, but it doesn't happen very often. When I was at McLaren, together with the team manager, we always went through these procedures on a regular basis, just in case. We had to be as familiar with something like an aborted start or an abandoned start or a red flag and then a restart. These kind of things are there to trip you up because you're not used to operating in that way. We're very much conditioned to a real slick operation for a regular race start. When something out of the ordinary happens, all of that kind of goes out the window. And, it really comes down to preparation. And there's no other way to say this. McLaren and Lando weren't prepared, or certainly Lando wasn't prepared in the right way. I'm recording this straight after the Grand Prix, by the way, so I still don't know of any penalties being applied as a result of this. But with an abandoned start, the drivers should stay on the grid. They effectively go back through the whole start procedure again. They would then do another formation lap once that start procedure has got to that stage, and then they go through, a regular race start again. Lando, as you know, left the grid. Others then followed. So I don't know how the stewards are going to look at this, because I can't think of another occasion when it's happened. But effectively, it does come down, in my mind, to a lack of preparation or understanding of those regulations. I don't want to be too critical, because of everything I said at the start, was this has been an incredibly difficult and upside down weekend for everybody. The pressure that everybody was under today, particularly if you think about Lando and Max, in this championship battle, the pressure was on, and that was a mistake. So we'll see what happens. By the time you see this, there may well be a decision. I'm sure there will. But it felt like they got tripped up by a set of unusual circumstances. So that was that. And then, of course, we got the actual race start. And again, Lando didn't quite nail it. And it's another one of those parts of the operation, another procedure. And we've seen it a number of times. I don't want to be too critical of Lando's starts, because actually, I think people have got the wrong impression of Lando's starts. He's not been a consistently bad starter. His opening laps have not yielded decent results for him, but there's lots of different reasons for that. His actual launches and his getaways have typically not been as bad as most people think. But today it was. Today he didn't get the drive. And of course, it's treacherous conditions. It's very, very difficult. But the man alongside him, George Russell, absolutely nailed it and got it right. Now, there might be an argument to say that he was illegally changing his tyre pressures on the grid. And perhaps there's something that could be said that with the tyre pressures that he eventually started the race on, which were adjusted illegally by the look of it, maybe that helped him get a great start. But I'm not going to say by any means that that's what got him ahead of Lando. I think it was just a better launch than Lando was able to get. Right? Maybe the pressure got to him. Maybe there was just different levels of grip on different sides of the track, and one was able to catapult further forward than the other. So I don't want to put it down too much as a mistake, but it is yet another incidence of Lando not getting through the first lap in the same position where he started the Grand Prix. The big problem with that, in these conditions, had Lando got himself in front at the start, you saw how effective Max was able to be after the point towards the end of the race when he got in front. The difference in being at the front of that field to being further back is enormous in these conditions. You've got the visibility that you need. You can use your tyres in the way that you need to. You can take lines you need to get the grip and to get the temperature in, and you can control your own race. When you're following another car, you're constantly battling the visibility, the spray. You're having to react to what the drivers in front and behind are doing to you. You're looking in your mirrors. When you're in front, you've got a lot more freedom to manage everything around your race. Max's stint at the end was a real example of that. Had Lando managed to get in front at the start, we might have seen a very different outcome, because that first stint may have got him in a much better position. Having said that, if we keep looking at Lando's race here, that virtual safety car was very unfortunate, and there's no other way to describe that. That was just bad luck, right? Lando and George were just caught out by the timing of the virtual safety car. There's nothing that anyone could have done differently about that. That's just the way it worked out, and he was unlucky. Other parts of the weekend, as we said earlier, Max Verstappen was pretty unlucky when the red flag came out in qualifying. So that's racing. No one really can argue about that. I don't even think Lando and McLaren can be upset with that. It's just bad luck. Then, of course, when they missed getting into the pits to make a reduced loss pit stop, as everyone else had the opportunity to do, because those two were out in front, missed the pit lane entry when the virtual safety car came out. Everyone else had the chance to do that. It then meant they had to react on the next lap or not. And that was the big decision there. Do you come in and get a new set of intermediate tyres, knowing that the virtual safety car is ending, knowing that you're going to lose out in terms of your pit lane loss time as a result of that? And although it looked like it was a really poor decision, I've got to say it's very difficult, almost impossible, to criticise the teams in those moments, because you're dealing with conditions that are changing lap by lap. You're looking at a weather radar which is pretty accurate, but not absolutely the written rule. It changes by the second, And they decided that being on a better tyre for the next phase of the race, which was definitely going to be wet, was the right option. And I actually think that was probably the right call. Yes, they may have held track position, but they had been on a very worn tyre, and they had no idea how long they would have to go on that with these changeable conditions. Obviously, as it turned out, when they got the red flag, it looked like, and obviously only with the benefit of hindsight, it was a poor decision. Now, I want to look at the other side of that, because of course, with that red flag, you can look at the three guys that eventually ended up on that podium, Max Verstappen and the two Alpine drivers who hadn't made a pit stop. And when the red flag came out, massively kind of lucked in because they got to take a free tyre change. As we know, the rule is there, whether you like it or not, the rule applies. You can take a tyre change under a red flag without penalty. You don't need to make any further pit stops. Now, you could look at that, and I think Lando's looked at that as saying, well, they really were very lucky. And of course they were. They were fortuitous with the timing, whereas Lando may have been unfortuitous with the timing on his side. You can also look at it, and this is the way I tend to look at these things, is that they put themselves in that position. The chance of a red flag happening or something untoward happening in that race was incredibly high. We'd seen chaos from start to finish. Running very long, as those three guys did, staying out, gambling, and not diving into the pits, with the very high possibility that there may come another opportunity to take a pit stop, either from a red flag, which could have come either because of a big accident or because of really heavy and bad rain, which they knew was also coming, for me was a real masterstroke. It wasn't just about luck. It was good strategic play, which all teams are trying to do. And yes, it came to them. It may well have not come to them, and it might have looked silly in the end, but it didn't. And if you think about race strategy, it's always about weighing up percentage chance and risk versus reward. It's looking at probability. The probability of a red flag in that race was high, and they gambled and played that card, and it worked for them. And, you know, for me, you've got to take your hats off to them for that. Red Bull and Max typically have been incredibly good over the last few years at getting these kind of decisions right. Max rarely makes a mistake in the car. The team rarely make very many mistakes from the pit wall either, and that's why they've been multiple world champions. McLaren, as we've touched on in earlier videos, are edging towards that. They're building towards that. They're not at the level that Red Bull are at, and they can't be. How could they be? This is their first opportunity of challenging for race wins and even being in the hunt for a championship. They don't have the experience. They don't have the recent experience for sure. Most people in that McLaren garage have never been in this situation before. So they're finding their feet, they're learning, they're having to take decisions without the benefit of having recent experience, without the confidence of being multiple champions in recent years. And that's the big difference between those two teams. It may be that that is the difference between Max winning this world title and Lando not. If you think back over the season, we can pinpoint a number of occasions when McLaren and Lando have probably left points on the table because of situations like this. As I said, hesitate to be too critical of anyone, and I'm not being critical of McLaren. I don't think McLaren did too much wrong today in terms of their actual race strategy. I just think the cards didn't fall for them. They definitely lost a bit of pace from their dry condition running to the way the car came. You know, the car didn't run very well in the wet, whereas at Red Bull, it was inversely opposite. Red Bull were struggling to match McLaren in the dry, but in the wet, that car and driver combination came alive, and you saw the dominance that Max was able to pull towards the end of that race. So I thought it was a fascinating Grand Prix. I've got to say big shouts out to Alpine. I was actually there at the factory this week and seeing how difficult things have been for Alpine over recent times. So many different struggles and different challenges that they've faced. Trying to keep people motivated back at base and within that race team has been very difficult. Today will be one of the biggest buzzes that many of those people in that team will ever get. An amazing scene. So very, very happy for all of those people. Everybody at the track, but also back at base as well, up at Enstone. So really well done to them. Some good performances from those around the top 10 as well. Some of the RBs, I thought, put in a decent performance. Some nightmares as well. I mean, Lewis Hamilton, what on earth happened to Lewis Hamilton? He, you know, somebody asked me earlier, why is Lewis Hamilton sort of gone off the boil? And I honestly think this is a similar type of situation to the likes of Daniel Ricciardo in recent times, Checo Perez. I don't think Daniel Ricciardo, Checo Perez or Lewis Hamilton have suddenly become bad drivers. I think the modern generation of cars are so specific, they're so nuanced in the way that you get the performance out of them. And in the case of those three drivers, it's not suiting the driving style that they're so used to, that's ingrained within them, that they have built their careers around. These cars require something very specific, both from a technical point of view when it comes to setting them up really low and stiff, but also in the way that you drive them, and it's not suiting those guys. They're struggling to get the tyre temperature into the tyres, and as soon as you don't get that, as soon as you fall out of that window, the performance disappears. And when the performance disappears, you struggle to get tyre temperature back in, and it's this vicious cycle that you can't get out of very easily. That is what I think is happening with Lewis. So if you're a Lewis Hamilton fan, take heart from that, in that when he joins Ferrari, it could well be that the Ferrari is a car that is much more suited to his driving style, and things could completely change. You know, it may not. I don't know. I don't know enough about the nuances of each of those cars and drivers, but let's see. Disaster for Sainz, disaster for Hamilton, disaster for Behrman after some great performances, disaster for Colapinto. I mean, his stock went down a little bit today. I mean, it's expected. First time he's driven a car in the wet. I mean, no one should be too critical of him, but it's been such a positive ride for him recently. It was a shame to see him end up in the wall. And big shouts out to the teams in those garages at Williams and at Aston Martin particularly, who had a lot of work on this weekend for very little reward. It was a tough weekend for all involved, particularly at those two teams, and they got very little out of it in the end. That's about all I think I've got to say. As I said, I don't know the results of the stewards' decisions as this video is being recorded. I don't think it's going to change my opinion too much. I think I suspect we're going to see penalties for those who failed through the aborted start procedure. I think we're going to see penalties for the Mercedes for adjusting tyre pressures. I think that's the only ones that we're waiting on right now, as far as I'm aware. But look, I hope you enjoyed the weekend. I thought it was a fascinating one for so many different reasons, mostly because it was chaos. It should have been a weekend from a Lando and McLaren point of view where the championship swung back in their favour. Engine penalties for Max Verstappen, disastrous qualifying, a wet race with Lando on pole, and yet it went somehow completely in the opposite direction. I hate to ever say a championship is done before it's done, but this is now looking very tricky for Lando. He now needs some exceptional circumstances, like Max finishing more than one, not finishing rather more than one race, and that seems unlikely. He will never give up. The team will never give up. Massive credit to them for getting into this position in the first place, and all eyes very soon will turn to next year, where I firmly believe McLaren will be able to start the season in possibly the strongest position and have a real crack at winning both titles before the rules all change in 2026. Keep across all of the stories, all of the news, the content, the videos, the social media streams as well, around any given subject that you want to follow in Formula One via the Seedstream F1 app. It's totally free to download. I use it every single day, and I'd love for you to give it a go too. Have a great week, folks. I'll see you soon. Ta-ra.